Welcome to another video on this series on saddle fitting. In this video we discuss the 12 steps of static or stationary saddle fit. This is a guide to the steps which should be taken before the rider gets into the saddle for the final part of saddle fitting.
So the steps of this static saddle fitting are, firstly, we want to prepare the horse in such a way that it's standing square and on level ground. We want it not to be uneven, because if it's resting one leg, that'll affect the shape of the spine and the position of the shoulders and make it really difficult to get an idea. The next thing I think is to secure and to place and secure the saddle. And ideally you get the owner to put it on and girth it up. If you're selling a saddle, that's a different matter. But if you're actually there to check what's going on when the owner's putting on a saddle, and you want to make sure they're putting in the right place, it's the best thing is to get them to pop it on and make sure that it's not being placed too far forward. The world standard for placement is 3 to 5 centimetres behind the scapula for a 16-hand horse. And for a lot of horse riders, they don't actually know where the back of the shoulder blade is. They might have been told to have it off the shoulder blade, but very often they have it on the back of the shoulder blade or giving it no clearance at all. Get the owner to lightly attach the girth to secure it in place. When I say lightly, sort of firm but not tight. And then we can actually start going over the saddle. Be just wary that some horses are maybe too sensitive to have a saddle fitted without a saddle cloth. We normally fit them without a saddle cloth so we can get the best feel for what's going on. But if you've got, say, a new saddle on trial, then always use a saddle cloth or a towel under the saddle. Or if the horse seems to be particularly sensitive over the skin, then certainly use a saddle cloth to help them feel more comfortable with the saddle, particularly if it's cold in winter or whatever. The next step, once we've got it on and lightly girthed up, then we want to establish that the saddle is really in the ballpark of being appropriate for the horse in its current shape. So we've got to check that the wither and the tree are a reasonable match, as with this picture from Mary Bromley's book on the right with the saddle tree sitting on the wither. You can see the tree should really be parallel to the muscle of the wither, and that of Susan Harris's diagram up top, where again it's reasonably parallel to the wither of the horse. This is particularly important with air panels such as care or flare panels. Tree needs to be supporting the panel evenly all the way, and if it's not parallel to the wither, that's not going to happen. This parallelism may be partially compensated for, if it's not quite right, by more flocking up or above or lower if the tree isn't a perfect match for the horse. That's a compromise, but that may be the case. And when you're feeling under the front of the saddle, the pressure when you push, should put your hand on top of the pommel and feel under the front panel of the saddle with that pressure pushing down like a rider would, or a girth or both would add pressure to the top. And so you can get a better idea of just what the horse is feeling underneath. And it should be even pressure along that tree point of the saddle, and should be the same on the upper side as the lower side. If it's getting tighter down the bottom, then the tree is, or the gullet plate is commonly a bit narrow. If it's tighter up, further up the wither and sort of open at the bottom, then the tree is probably too wide for the horse. So as I said, it's not just the tree, it's the combination of the gullet with the tree point and the flock underneath it that we're looking at. But that flock should be fitted fairly parallel over the tree point at any rate. So we also want to check the position of the contact at the wither. We want to check whether the contact is really high up on the wither, because if it's a saddle that's being used for slow work, then if it's really high, then it's in real danger of pushing inwards against the spinalis muscle direct and compartmentalizing the pressure against the bone, as we've discussed. If it's lower down, then it's going to have more muscle bulk that it's pressing on. Even in a narrow wither, it's got more muscle bulk further out, and so the inward pressure isn't going to be so bad. The other thing we need to do is slip our hands in at this stage and check down the side of the wither to check that the stirrup bars are not, which are at the top of the panel, usually are not putting pressure further down on the wither. When we're looking at the saddles, we want to be aware of whether they have a short tree point, like this one on the left, or a longer tree point, and whether they've got a narrow one or quite a wide one. And all this makes a big difference to how the saddle and the tree at the front works. Also, where the panels, if we go back one, where the panels are put on the actual gullet area. And you can see on the right the panel actually starts up higher on the tree point than the one on the left, which is set down only effectively difference of 5 centimetres, but that 5 centimetres is huge when it comes to comfort of the horse. So check what is actually happening there, and we'll see from underneath that you can get an idea. This is a short tree-pointed saddle on the left, and you can see that crease, which is often quite apparent, and you can feel the movement below that area when you squash in from the side into the saddle. That will give you an idea of the tree point length. If it's quite short and it's up high, then it's very concentrated pressure up high on the wither. It's going to put a lot of pressure into the spinalis muscles. Whereas it lower down, like this one on the right, you can see how the tree point is extending all the way down to here. This is all tree point down here, and it says supporting down to here in this saddle. So we've got a long support and lower down. This is a much better recipe for comfort for the horse. So when we're doing this step, we're checking the clearance of the saddle over the dorsal spinous processes. And this is an absolute basic. You don't want the inside of the saddle rubbing on the tips of the vertebrae, the tops of the tips of the vertebrae. And that, I think every rider from 5 years old understands that as a basic thing. You can't have the saddle sitting on the top of the vertebrae. And the old standards were if a saddle was ungirthed, there should be 4 fingers of the rider's fingers in distance between the bones and the saddle. And when the saddle was girthed up, there should be 3. And if you had new flock in the saddle, then you should allow an extra finger width. But this is not really used as a hard and fast rule anymore. It used to be. Basically, that the clearance has to be adequate under all circumstances. And so this 4 fingers can be only as much as a finger and a half or 2 fingers with the rider in the saddle and a well-matched eventing saddle, for instance. At the same time, as I was mentioning before, you need to go down into the front of the saddle, into the gullet, and examine along the spine and make sure that the stirrup bar at this level here particularly and the panels on the inside are not pressing close to the spine over the small back muscles, over the multifidus muscles, and causing damage. This saddle you can see fitted here is actually sitting right on the back of the shoulder blade, so it's a little bit far forward. The saddle balance is the next thing we look at, and typically in a dressage saddle, and most saddles, the saddle balance is, or the lowest point of the saddle is at the middle of the saddle seat. And the cantle in most dressage and show saddles is higher than the pommel, but may not be so in the likes of an eventing saddle, or as in a cross-country saddle or a jumping saddle. It may be lower. And for that matter, in some of the older riding saddles, show saddles, they're certainly lower than the current fashion for higher cantles to sort of hold the rider in. And some people like a nice open seat, and some people like a really supportive seat. So when the saddles are imbalanced, they can be uphill or downhill. This one's going what they call uphill, where it's low at the saddle seat and going forward. It's going uphill, and it's very much uphill when you're riding, because to rise out of the stirrups is quite difficult when the saddle seat is low. You can make a lot more work of rising to the trot. when it's like this, it puts a lot of pressure on the saddle seat area and a lot of weight over the actual back of the rib cage, and is really hard on the horse's back. And this sort of situation occurs particularly when the saddles are too far forward and sitting on the shoulder blades, but it also occurs when the front of the saddle is too narrow for the horse. The opposite can occur, and this is not very common, but it certainly happens, where it's too low in front. And this can be where a gullet plate that's put in here is too wide, or it's a saddle that has got a fixed gullet plate, but is been put on a horse that the saddle is too wide for. This tends to throw the rider forward, and the riders sometimes don't realise that they're actually going forward or being moved forwards, and they just automatically lean back to compensate. And some of them, unless they're filmed or told by their instructor, don't realise that they're actually leaning backwards to compensate in this situation. And something as simple as that, if a saddle's tending to fall forward, can really put off a rider as far as how comfortable they are with a saddle. If it's a new saddle, they can really get the wrong impression about how that saddle works for them. And in this situation, the rider's legs would be going back. The rider would be really not very happy with the situation. If they were when they were trying to sit straight, everything would be going wrong. When this happens, it's not only a rider problem, but it's also a horse problem, because a gullet that is too wide for a horse usually leaves pressure on what I call the heel or inner part of the panel underneath the saddle, and instead of being parallel between the horse's wither and the tree point, it's like this. So there's a lot of the pressures here, and this outer part of the tree point is not really active and bearing weight very well. So a lot of the weight is really concentrated over a smaller area. And what happens is that the weight falls backwards onto the stirrup bars too. And that occurs really close often to the dorsal spinous processes, right over the multifidus or little small spinal muscles, and makes the horse really sore. This of course can occur if the saddle's put too far back as well as the other possibility. The next step is to fit the arc or the lengthways shape of the back. You should have already examined the front of the saddle to check the gullet plate match and everything. And like when you did that and you put weight on the pommel, you put weight on the seat for this, and you put your hand underneath and feel what the horse is feeling along its back. So you put your hand up that way, not that way, but that way to feel the saddle surface that the horse is feeling, right up to the saddle seat and beyond the saddle seat. And what you should be feeling is that panel's in nice contact all the way through. So it's the lengthways fit of the saddle. If you look, someone shines a light here, and you peer up under this area here, you shouldn't be able to see that light. It should be all closed up. When you're feeling under the saddle, it should be, if the horse is just in a resting posture, their back should be dropped a little bit. So you should feel a little bit lighter pressure under the middle of the saddle, under the waist, and more pressure at the front and more pressure at the back of the seat as a result. But this should change when the horse gets into a moving frame where they're lifting the back properly. So if we look at this in a figurative sort of way, if we looked at the pressure measurements along the horse's back, the panels should be coming along something like this on either side of the horse's back along the length, with the head up here and the tail down here, obviously. If the saddle is bridging or in 4-point contact, it's being supported at the front and the back, but not very well at all through the waist. So even with the horse lifting its back, it's not going to be in good contact. And some horses are not able to lift their back, so it needs to be that way, whatever. And this is a representation of the actual pressure pad measurements, sort of front and back, in a crude sort of fashion. The opposite to that is what's called rocking or high centering, where we've got more of a banana type saddle situation, where there's pressure through the middle of the back, and you see that reflected here on each side. and compared to all the way along the back. And in these saddles, they tend to rock as it's called. When you put pressure front and back on the saddle, then the saddle will rock or seesaw on that high pressure point or pivot point in the middle. And if a horse is ridden in these sort of saddles all the time, then the horse will get a greater and greater sway back until it's the same shape as the saddle. So it acts as an orthopedic brace and changes the actual shape of the horse. Some saddle fitters consider that mild rocking is not a problem. When you put a rider's weight on it, it'll all sink and be all just perfect. Well, no, it is a problem because it's actually encouraging that sinking and not allowing the horse to lift its back during its work. The next step is the pitch of the spine, and this refers to the spine from back to front, looking at the angle of the spine over the saddle seat. So we're not talking about the pitch of the wither here, we're talking about the saddle seat area and the pitch along the contact of the saddle under the waist and the saddle seat. And the panels of the saddle should actually match that in angle. And certainly in some of the foam saddles, they can be sticking really acutely into the back of a flat-backed horse, or in others they can be too wide and all the weight's carried on the inside of the panels on either side along the back. So that what we should see is not sitting away like on this young horse, unless the flock was soft enough that the saddle sort of sunk down enough without getting too close to the midline of the horse's back, where those small back muscles are likely to get affected by pressure. We don't want it to sink down too much, but we need to have even contact along the back. So very important to fit the pitch of the spine. The other thing is with these panels in flatter backed horses, sometimes they sort of look like this, but when you press on them, they just dive in the flock is inadequate and not enough support. So there's got to be adequate amount of flock in these panels to make them work for their whole width. Otherwise, they're just sitting on a more constricted area just through here. And now with young horses like one like this, that'll be developing and putting on weight and broadening, then sometimes you've got to sort of keep that in mind with selecting saddles for the horse or the owner has, to have one that can adjust to the changes in the weight and muscling of the horse. Pitch of the back we can see here can vary a great deal. So the average sort of pitch is this one in the middle, and this is very flat one where it's really quite difficult to fit a treed saddle. Sometimes we're going to go for a treeless saddle to fit a horse like this, or it's even perhaps a bit too flat for a Western saddle. The best thing is to get some weight off this horse and get it a lot fitter before you put fit it to a saddle. This one here is got a lot more angle to the spine and comes under the category of a rafter type pitch, like the rafters of a house, and got to be really careful along the spine here, along the multifidus muscles, that pressure isn't applied too much to this area here. The panels give enough clearance here to avoid pressuring that area. So we get to the length of the saddle, and this is a bit of an involved area. To play safe, the standard recommendation about the length of the saddle is that it should be no longer than going to the last rib of the horse. It shouldn't go into the line at all. And this is a very standard one, and it's one that many saddle fitters stick to like it's a hard and fast rule, and that at times is to the detriment of the horse and rider, because there are horses where that rule can be fudged a bit, can be broken a bit, and in some cases is broken a lot, such as in this horse to the right here that's got a strong back. I'm not saying that this saddle should be used, but they can certainly handle a longer saddle when you're a strong quarter horse like this. So the Royal Society of Master Saddlers for a long time said this rule was Loctite, black and white. but of recent times they've actually softened and realised that when you see horses like this wearing Western saddle and you say that, oh, I can't go past the rib cage, and the actual bars are ending up mid-loin and the horse is quite comfortable with it, it makes it a little bit of a fallacy to say that this should be a hard and fast rule. So the Society of Master Saddlers has certainly recognised this and recognised there are times when it is suitable to go a bit into the loin or considerably into the loin. So as I said, traditionally it's been a black and white rule that we mustn't go past this last rib area. It certainly hasn't got much support past that in this rib area as it is. So we don't want to load that too much, and we'll talk about this being loaded too much very shortly. The loin area actually is really a strong structure, and as I mentioned, that's where circus riders stand when they ride on a bareback horse quite often. There are a number of situations where you certainly shouldn't go beyond the rib cage though, and that's where the horse hasn't got the strength to lift its back and keep it straight under the rider. If it can't keep its back straight and support the saddle right through into the loin, then it should not have a saddle extending past the rib cage, because to do so will leave the horse very sore around here. This area here, where when this drops and this goes up, this area gets strained. This area gets some really acutely sore spots, and that can lead a horse to very readily buck from pressure in that area. So it's an area that needs to be guarded. So there's good reason where the horse is going to drop its rib cage, and it's much safer to keep it within the rib cage. But also, if it's dropping its back, we've really got to consider that we shouldn't have a very heavy rider on it either. So that becomes another element of the conversation. So this is a saddle that's into the loin. It's a little bit glary, this photo, sorry. It is going into the loin, and this pony was really super strong pony. It was carrying a sort of medium weight rider, and it was doing really well. It's important with these situations that the back of the saddle here is not too firm. It's got to have give for when it does put pressure into the loin. So it's something to be done with care and done with real attention to pain in this area and making sure that they are comfortable to be able to carry the saddle there and have the strength to keep their belly up all the time and not drop their belly under the rider, and therefore drop this point of the saddle, the panel, into their loin and into that area that can be strained. If we try and put a rider that's in this size saddle into a smaller saddle just to avoid going into the loin, then we're actually going to do this pony real disservice, because we're actually going to put weight over the weaker part of his back and concentrate the weight really heavily, as we'll see here. So in this case, this pony, to fit this adult saddle on it, has been put right forward onto the shoulder blade. So it's going to move with every stride over the shoulder blades, and it's actually going to, the rider is going to be sitting low in the saddle seat and putting in a lot of pressure and a lot of their weight directly on the saddle seat area. This is another way of getting around putting a bigger rider on a smaller horse, is cutting back the panels here so that they're really quite small. And as a result, the pressure in this from the rider's weight and from the leverage of the actual cantle is going to be quite high here and put a great deal of pressure here and exacerbate this tendency of this horse to drop its belly and disengage its abdominal muscles and get weaker and weaker through the back, get kissing spines, get strain of the loin, and get arthritis developing there very fast. These saddles virtually pivot off this point here at the back of the saddle flap, and that really puts a great deal of pressure on the rib cage, and painful pressure there, because these saddles are ones that are not just shortened but are curved up towards the seat, and that means that this is rocking on this point here effectively and putting a great deal of pressure on that seat. Next, if we look at the channel underneath, so we've got the gullet extends right through the saddle, or it's commonly known as the channel through this area, or the whole combination of it is called the chamber, three-dimensional structure through here. You can see in this saddle that the channel is really very narrow. You can see in this one it is extremely wide, and this is probably taken to extreme too far, because it means that you've got a narrow, this is a big saddle for a big horse, big rider, and this has got a reduced panel on it as a result. We've lost a lot of surface area by moving these panels a fair way out. So there's a compromise to be made. This is a pretty big saddle with a huge panel for the real comfort of the horse, and it's got a decently wide channel through it. The reason we need a wide channel, like we were talking about earlier in that other horse, is that we need to avoid putting too much pressure that'll come down onto multifidus muscles. Certainly when they've lost muscle like this and lost condition, that's starting to put angular, a vector of pressure into the bone too, like we have in the wither. So we'll get pressure over here, and we'll get pressure also over the bony prominences of the vertebrae, and that will potentially make the horse very sore in that region and drop its back even further and exacerbate everything that's above. This sort of narrowness of the channel usually happens in older saddles over time and is a difficult thing to manage, and usually means a new saddle in most cases. Not only have we got to look at the width of it, but we've also got to look at the depth. So this one has a nice width and is going to have a good chance of clearing things out here. In this horse's case, it might need some extra. It might need some extra feed and work before you consider putting a saddle on it, because I think there'd be a chance that even with a saddle on the right that you would put pressure along the spine. So more weight required there, more condition required there in the way of muscle. If you've got a fairly flat-backed horse, then a treeless saddle like this one without much of a depth to its channel will be very much fine, and you want to actually get very close with your saddles to these horses, otherwise they just roll everywhere. So there's different things that work with different horses in different situations. In this case, be struggling for virtually anything. You can't just put a pad on here, because that'll just exacerbate the pressure over this area. Two, it'll effectively make the channel narrower rather than actually help the horse much. It'll give it some comfort for a very short ride, but it won't last very long. Another thing to consider is where the girth points are going, and this is a really important part of the saddle, where the girth points go in a horse like this that's retired and out in the paddock. The girth notch is going to be right forward. And this is the other extreme, racehorse, where the girth is sitting back here. And this is the ideal place for a girth, back here on a horse's chest, not just behind the elbows, but a girth is going to move all the time to its smallest circumference. In this case, it moves back, so we've got to do something about stopping it going back. In this case, it'll go forward onto the elbow and it'll stop there, but that's going to be uncomfortable to have the girth right at the back of the elbow, and it's going to pull the saddle with it. So it's a very important part of the saddle, very important that it's dealt with correctly. The girth itself, its comfort is often underrated too. It's very important. The girth needs to be reasonably wide. This is too narrow, and it's particularly down here at where the sternum goes from down the side and around the sternum, the actual square edge of that, if you like, in most horses, where the most pressure is felt, and we see the most pressure changes in the hair coat colour occur. This girth is hard to see, but it's actually got a narrow band down the middle and is effectively only 2.5 centimetres wide as this band down the middle. This bit on the side is really floppy and is doing very little. It's mainly the band in the middle. This one here is wider and got 2 bands down it, and actually functions really quite well because these bands actually support the full width of the girth really well. But in this one that's cut down, one band is not very comfortable for the horse, and this pony wasn't very comfortable in that one. So the saddle girth area is really important, as I said. This horse on the left is in the common category where the girth area is just back from the elbow but not immediately behind the elbow, and is fairly flat, and so works reasonably well with a flat girth like that basic one I was talking about. There are better ones like the Stuben Equisoft and where the saddles are stable enough, the Prestige A52 Relaxed Performance Girth works super well, but they're more expensive girths but worth every cent in my view. If you use what's known as an anatomical girth, when they're talking about the ones that were used for the Olympic horses, those ones were made for horses like this, where the circumference of the front of the girth was bigger than the circumference of the back of the girth, and they were shaped accordingly and had a bit bigger circumference to the front and smaller to the back. If those anatomical ones are used on horses like this, then they cut into the belly and make the horses sore. And this is super common thing that I see in my practice, that people come in with these supposedly flash anatomical girths that were great at the Olympics and using them on horses that are like this. They're made for horses like this. They are not made for ones like that, and they don't suit them at all, and they make them sore. The other thing that should be checked is the pads that are used under the saddle. If it's just a normal saddle cloth of this sort of style in a cotton or in a wool, like the old Pony Club ones, then they tend to be reasonably comfortable for the horse. If the person is putting a number under this, that if it doesn't get too thick, then that is quite a good thing. Numbers give them an extra bit of comfort, and that works fine. If they're trying to put too much under the saddle, then what they're going to do is do what this diagram of Joyce Harmon shows, that this is pretty high contact for a start. Without a pad, the panel is sitting here on the horse's back and putting the pressure into here, which is too high in my view, but if we move that down, it'll be better. And if we then put a lift pad underneath it on both sides, then basically we're lifting that saddle further up the wither and putting the pressure higher in the wither where there's even less muscle to protect the bony surface. Where it comes onto the bony surface, you're going to make horses sore and sore with these. So this is a real problem where people think they're doing the right thing, but they're actually lifting the saddle into more uncomfortable territory. It'll give the horse a bit of relief for a short while, but they'll get sore, and then they think the behaviour that they develop is just because of the horse is behaving badly, not because they've actually got a greater problem. The other thing with the saddle cloths is make sure that they're a shaped one according to the shape of the horse. And thus we've been through 12 steps of static saddle fit, and this is the summary for you. And I hope this helps you do the job of saddle fitting even better than you have before, or is a good reminder for you if you're really on top of it all. Thanks for watching.